All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to what will become the last lecture of this course. As such, it will, in many ways, be both its own kind of material and trying to present those ideas to you, but it's also going to be a little bit of a culmination, capstone project for you all. So that'll be hopefully something kind of interesting to just reflect on how far we've come, what all we've learned, where we are going, and what we might take with us as, a part of this class. Whether it's the 8-week or 16-week version, it's been a kind of long version of trying to, or long story of trying to learn politics, develop as people, develop as students, and hopefully we've come away from all of that process with a little something to show for it, and things that we're going to remember, takeaways that we're going to hold on to. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into our slides. This is going to be the third part of our political economy unit, and it's going to work in some aspects of the civil rights discussion and whatnot. But we're talking land and changing demographics today. Things that are going to be covered include land and real estate policies over time, their relationships to wealth and economy, generational wealth, and economic disparities, and then changing demographics. So things like the increased level of, different minority folks that live in our country, mixed ancestry as a new phenomenon relatively in the mass levels that we're seeing it, and kind of ongoing questions around what the United States is going to look like in 20, 30, 40 years, and however long that it might be. So just as a reminder from the beginning, I mentioned the kind of disparity between the ways that the US as a settler colony is still a colony, but looks very different from the extractive colonies that we're kind of generally familiar with when we think about colonialism. Settler colonies are those that focus on land, the creation of a new home for the settlers, and the elimination of those that live on that land to create that new home. And therefore, the governments and policies that form around those governments in settler colonies are very disproportionately focused on the idea of a abundance of land, the need to claim land, the need to defend land, and the need to kind of occupy, develop, and quote unquote improve land and displace folks that live on land in a way that other places are not. If in many ways, the way I often characterize it is that most governments and colonial structures are about people and goods, and settler colonies are about land. Not that people and goods are obviously not part of that land, but the focus creates some interesting policy differences. Some of the ones that we're going to talk about today that are along those lines are the Homestead Act from the mid-1800s, the GI Bill from after World War II, redlining, which was a policy that took place from the early 1930s until today, and ongoing questions around housing, real estate, and infrastructure in those communities, all the way up to 2024 today. The first one that we will cover on that is the Homestead Act. I mentioned this briefly earlier on in the course, but we'll get into it a little bit more thoroughly. So the Homestead Act dates back to the Manifest Destiny era, or during the Civil War, technically, in 1862. And what the policy was that if explicitly white Americans go west at that time and settle land in what is today, the flyover states, Idaho, Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and so on and so forth, they would be given land for effectively free from the government, simply for the fact of them getting up from Boston or New York or wherever they live and getting in one of those wagon trains that we all, cosplayed for Pioneer Day if we did elementary school out here, and became a pioneer and built what was called a homestead, so a house on that land, and started farming it or whatever that might be. And that is why it's called the Homestead Act. The amount of land given was roughly 160 acres. Acre is roughly the size of a football field. And so 160 football fields of land for basically free is a hell of a lot of land to just kind of hand out like your Oprah or whatnot. So that incentive was pretty good. It created a mass exodus west. If the US had kind of claimed a lot of this land already, but there was a general void of population between California from the gold rush and basically the Mississippi River, which was the end of the major populated parts. So like Chicago, was the major parts of population in the US. Um, then that area was about to start to be filled pretty rapidly, and you got your big-ish cities started to kind of pop up, your Denvers and your Boulder, Colorados, and your the Oregon Trail as it was named, so Portland and Eugene and Salem, and all the places in Nevada, Carson City and whatnot. Vegas would come a little later, but Carson City and Reno especially, and so on. Date to this time, and people kind of taking the tracts of land in between to grow, whatever crops that they might want to grow on 160 acres of land. In total, after all the policies of the Homestead Act, 10% of the total land area of the US was given away to folks as a result of this act. The US is a immense, immense country, one of the largest on the entire planet, and 10% of its entire land area was handed away for free during this act. But how was that land gained, and who paid the cost? Because nothing is free in the world. So if you're giving land away to people for free, something and someone is paying that cost. Well, the first thing is most of the land that was given away as part of the Homestead Act was by treaty ceded to Native American folks by the US government. And so it was in direct violation of those treaties, such as the Fort Laramie Treaty, amongst others. That the U.S. seized land that it promised not to seize and gave it away to the settlers as part of the Homestead Act. And that required the further displacement of already displaced indigenous folks, the tightening of reservations, and the kind of further corralling of folks onto those reservations and the shrinking of those reservations, and the militarized massacre and displacement of those people to make that happen and clear the land so that there was, the quote unquote illusion of the empty country for people to come and claim when they got on their wagons and went around. Of course, we do hear from all of this the kind of mythology that appears from that time that, the Native Americans are doing like raiding wagon trains and so on. But, who wouldn't raid a wagon train that's going to come and occupy your land? It kind of makes some sense to some degree. Um, but beyond just the people, there was also mass destruction of wildlife and wilderness in the western US as a result of trying to clear the land for people and cattle and crops and whatnot. So people and the land paid an immense price for the Homestead Act for people, and white folks specifically, to be able to get and settle, their free land. And that is classic settler colonial logic in a sense. You have literal settlers looking to gain the land at no kind of heed to the cost to the world around them, other people that already live there, nature, etc. And as far as who did the fighting, well, one of the major forces that were used were what was called the Buffalo Soldiers. If anyone knows the all-time classic favorite Bob Marley song, Buffalo Soldier, Dreadrock Rasta, that is, the history that he is invoking in that song, which is black soldiers, folks who are recently freed from slavery and in many cases kind of running away from the South and the poor employment prospects and whatnot down there, even if you are a freed person. So they sign up for the army and they become Buffalo Soldiers, and they become some of the frontline people who have to do that displacement and that massacring of the indigenous folks, so that the white soldiers from the Civil War can go back home to their families. Um, and so there's this kind of weird, complicated history between the usage of racialized bodies to massacre other racialized bodies so that less racialized bodies can go west and get a bunch of land. Um, and that was, much of what's kind of going on in the Buffalo Soldier song as well. He was stolen from Africa, brought to America, fighting on arrival, fighting for survival. As the song might say. And when that fighting kind of refers to that idea of, okay, so you're sent off to war for your survival. as a Buffalo Soldier, even though you know that the war might be wrong. And maybe you don't, because eventually the Dreadlock Rasta becomes the Buffalo Soldier. Eventually you kind of start to believe it, and, become a part of that machine, even if you otherwise might see that what you're doing is morally reprehensible. So that becomes parts of the Homestead Act. And, that wealth that was gained from that land is an immense, immense part of the kind of disparities of wealth between racial and ethnic groups today is because, even if incomes are relatively similar, when your family generations ago got 160 acres of land for free, that's going to make a major difference in how wealthy you are, now and today, as long as your family was able to keep that land or sell it and make a business or, whatever it might be. Some of the consequences of this. Well, I mentioned some of the economic ones. Land is a growing form of capital. You can use it to as collateral for loans if you want to found a business. You can sell it and then move to the West Coast and buy a nice house in Newport Beach. You can, improve it or, turn it into a shopping mall once cities start to form in those areas. You can do whatever you would like. It's 160 acres of land. That's a lot of things that you could do. We talked about some of the consequences to indigenous folks, but we're going to continue that. And I will preface this right now with a content warning for various forms of non-consensual sexual acts on the next slide. So once I flip the slide, if that's something that's sensitive to you, please do kind of keep that of note and recuse yourself as necessary. And look after yourself in that way. So just that quick content warning there. Um, but it wasn't a good time. A lot of the kind of heroes and legendary figures, Sitting Bull, Geronimo, Crazy Horse, Chief Joseph, and so on, that we celebrate as kind of icons of indigenous resistance and indigenous ways of life, come from this exact era, where they're kind of the last holdouts fighting to not have their land taken over for homesteaders and, fight their guerrilla campaigns and so on and so forth, or in the case of Chief Joseph, try to march people to other land that wouldn't be occupied, only to, be captured and either shot up or put on reservations and so on. So we have all these figures that are kind of romanticized, but also, the things that they're fighting are a very real, cruel machine that desires their destruction. That is the logic of land-based settler colonialism, is anyone else who might have a claim to that land must be removed, because the land is, the whole focus of the policy. And then there's the questions to wildlife. So we have the near extinction because directly because of settlers moving west, of a lot of animals that lived in the Western United States, including wolves, bison, beavers, and the attempt to destroy coyotes. I will play a clip shortly of wolves from classic YouTuber Casual Geographic. So we'll see that in a minute. But before we get to wolves, why did wolves die? Or why were wolves kind of nearly put to extinction? Well, because people thought that they would eat their cows. And so there was policy to kill on site to protect the land that was, grazing land from the wolves. And then wolves, were so badly like destroyed by these policies that we had to solicit Canada to send us wolves from Canada to repopulate when we realized how important wolves were and how screwed we were that we, completely annihilated their population. Then there was bison, also known as buffalo. The American buffalo, basically, which the range up here. So we have in light pink the original range of buffalo within the United States, basically before any kind of European settler occupation of the land. Hell of a large portion of the country. As of 1870, you have this kind of other pinkish color here, this more magenta-ish color, which was the range of buffalo as the Homestead Act was kind of beginning and already beginning to curtail this range. And then you have in those little dark purplish color, the places where they lived in 1889 and up until today. So the American bison which used to number in the millions, was reduced to somewhere in the range of a couple thousand by the end of this whole period. And it got so bad that even today, with major conservation efforts and repopulation efforts being put in, they're back to the realm of, a couple hundred thousand. But that would still be 10% or less of the original population. And they were nearly wiped off the face of the map. Over here, we have the image of, and this was not just like an accident. That's the thing. That's what this image down here shows us. This was a coordinated effort by the military and settlers to massacre the buffalo because the indigenous folks relied on them for food, and it was a scorched earth policy to kill the buffalo, not for food, not because, they were a pest or dangerous or anything like that, but simply so that indigenous folks would not be able to hunt them to survive and would therefore put up less resistance. There was a famous policy of paying for bison hunting tourism to outsource some of that labor, where you could get on a train, and while your train is going, you could point your rifle out of the train and pop a cap in the ass of any bison that you saw, and then just leave it there to die in the middle of the plains. Basically for fun, for memes. You wouldn't eat it, you wouldn't, use its body in any way. You would just kind of massacre them willy-nilly just for fun. And this Tower of Skulls, yes, real image, yes, verified by Snopes and other reputable organizations, is the example of the level of casualties of wildlife we saw as a result of this expansion policy. The statistic that it gives is that the American military killed 1.5 million buffalo, 1.5 million buffalo in 1 year alone. Not, and they did more the next year, and they did more the year before, but 1.5 million buffalo in 1 year, so that indigenous folks could not hunt the buffalo and survive and would be forced to concede their land and go to reservations. The staggering cost in lives of the Homestead Act should be shocking and should be terrifying for us to kind of think about. Other animals that met their doom include beavers, um, mostly for fur in their case, because it's cold up in, this part of the country, and beaver fur is pretty warm. And so beavers were hunted extensively, to the point that in the early 1900s, there was one single family of beavers left in the entire area that's today Yellowstone Park. One family. That's it. We'll see in the clip that I will play shortly how devastating that actually was to Yellowstone, because beavers be extremely important. Otters also paid an immense cost along the coast, sea otters, which sea otters are also a keystone species that play an immense role in kind of keeping our ecology surviving. And sea otters were also hunted for fur, and there was, somewhere in the range of maybe 50 sea otters left about 50 years ago. That number is climbing, but they were also pretty much wiped off the face of the planet. And then there's coyotes. Um, Coyotes are one of the only animals that live in all 48 US states and Alaska. And trust me, if they could get to Hawaii, they'd probably be there too. Um, they were also attempted to be destroyed, but coyotes are just so resilient for a lot of ecological reasons that you don't need to know for poli-sci, but that are pretty fascinating, including the fact that they are more malleable in their family groups, that they produce more young the more coyotes you kill, so that they can replace their population faster, and that they're just one of the few animals that is really adapted to living in cities, living off of trash and small rodents and like mice and whatnot that are really common in cities. And so it just became that no matter how many the settlers killed, more and more coyotes were born. The other big thing was the massive destruction of wolves. The one of the biggest things that kind of kept coyotes in check, actually gave coyotes free reign, to go around the whole US, unchallenged, more or less. We'll briefly go ahead and exit here, and then we will stop the share, go to the YouTube clip, um, and we will go ahead and wow. we initiate the share for the YouTube clip and cue the video for a little bit.
Life is just a never-ending game of Jenga.
All right, sorry. Reshare, share sound, optimize for video sharing. My bad.
All you're trying to do is build something worth the effort without it all crashing down and scratching your mother's coffee table. And the thing with Jenga is, every block's important, but some blocks are just an instant game over. Nature's kind of the same way. Every animal, from mosquitoes to monkeys, from pigeons to platypuses.
Okay, we figured it out. Let's go ahead and oh, sorry, one more time. Share sound, optimize. Yes, okay, good. Share and play.
Life is just a never-ending game of Jenga, where all you're trying to do is build something worth the effort without it all crashing down and scratching your mother's coffee table. And the thing with Jenga is, every block's important, but some blocks are just an instant game over. Nature's kind of the same way. Every animal, from mosquitoes to monkeys, from pigeons to platypuses, everything with a heartbeat has some type of role in this giant ball of dirt and water. But where losing some animals might be bad for the environment, losing certain animals could be GG's for the whole thing. The worst part is, we usually don't know which block is a trip block until someone plays God and pulls it. Like with the sea otter. Okay, disclaimer, I don't think I've ever been more conflicted about an animal. Like, I'm smart enough to know these water wolverines are wild animals that'll play gotcha nose with their teeth, and that'll have you looking like you could unlock Voldemort's phone. But I'm also dumb enough to let them. Just cause they're cute. I'm aware they have one of the most violent mating rituals I've ever read about, but they also hold hands while sleeping and they wrap their babies in kelp blankets so they don't float away. One thing I will say is that without these water weasels, the ocean would almost certainly be in a pack. And it's all because sea otters need a borderline eating disorder just to survive. These guys are all marine mammals, but one is not like the others. Sea otters don't have blubber or a layer of fat to keep them warm. When you live in the ocean full time, that's living life on veteran difficulty, which is why sea otters can put away 25% of their body weight in food every single day, all just to fuel their metabolism and not freeze from otter to article. 25% in food would be like me downing 95 Big Macs. I know this because I did the math. Don't ask me if I have a problem, I probably do. These furry food vacuums have a grocery list of basically anything that isn't nailed down, but the most important thing they eat are sea urchins. A motivated male can put away up to 50 sea urchins in a 24-hour binge, which is what makes this high sea honey badger one of those do not touch Jenga blocks. Cause sea urchins are vicious vegans that eat kelp like they get paid for it. Kelp forests provide food as well as shelter and a nursery for several species of animals. Not only that, but this water cactus will literally spawn camp. They'll go into this weird hibernation on top of a kelp bed, but only reanimate to eat any seaweed that sprouts up. So without otters to keep the sea urchins in check, a bunch of animals would basically become homeless, if not starved in past tense completely. Pretty much Jenga-ing this entire community. And it literally took nearly hunting this live-action plush toy into extinction before we realized this. I showed this picture before for a reason. In places where sea otters were stat padded into oblivion and the sea urchins started wilding out, what used to be kelp forests quickly became underwater deserts. Basically diversity dead spots. Instead of a PWI, this dead spot represents the loss of an ecosystem that actually helps us more than most people realize. Add the fact that kelp forests help fight climate change, and you begin to realize just how wild the butterfly effect really is. Some guy liked the way a certain coat fell, next thing you know, global warming's up 3-1 on us. Sea otters aren't the only ones with that kind of power. This is a wolf eel. It's not a wolf, it's not an eel.
And we'll pause a little bit. We don't need to see this part specifically, though you can definitely check out the video if you're interested. And we're going to go to beavers, who are, again, relevant to policy at hand that we're considering, and wolves.
Species, but one of the most famous and the one you likely learned about first are probably beavers. Since beavers shape their entire communities just by being themselves. They're bucktooth engineers that'll build dams to create ponds. In the middle of these ponds are lodges, and that is the beaver's home address. Having waterside real estate makes it less likely for them to get turned into a Happy Meal by bears, wolves, cougars, coyotes, owls, lynxes, bobcat. You see why they need the lodge? Without it, they're the lollipop of the north. They take licks from everybody. But it also means in some places, beavers are single-handedly responsible for creating wetlands, making the beaver yet another key block on the Jenga tower. Beaver dams and the wetlands they create lead to more herbaceous plants growing by the water. They also help clean out pollution from rivers and streams, and about half of the endangered species in North America depend on the wetlands the beavers help engineer. Basically take out this plus-size water gerbil and you're sentencing several animals to the gulag too. Also, if you play the sound of running water on a speaker, beavers will instinctively start building a dam over it. That has nothing to do with anything, I just find that fact fun. But unlike beavers, most keystone species are usually predators, and that concept's pretty simple. Without an equalizer to eat the prey would ironically eat themselves and everything around them to death. Which is why tiger sharks also earn a keystone title. Here are some things that have been found inside a tiger shark.
Also skipping the tiger shark portion. Again, check it out if you would like on your own. And here we go.
Who's Scott Ball's priority?
Add. We will go ahead and pause the. So resuming recording, we should have the ads taken care of. Political ads in a political science class is always hilarious, simply because it's election season. That shows us the ideas of some of the media stuff we talked about last week, and the ad campaigns and whatnot. Congressional ads are more common in California than presidential ones because the congressional races are actually competitive, and the presidential one is not. And that is why there was a congressional ad on the YouTube feed. Anyway, with all that being said, we'll go ahead and continue the video.
Yeah, that's probably strike two. But oftentimes, it takes a tower toppling over to realize just how important that block was. Best example is when we literally had to mess around and find out in Yellowstone. If you haven't heard this story, you about to hear some shit. Once upon a time, the cousin of man's best friend was public enemy #1, and wolves got put on a list. And the reason why? Well, if wolves didn't hate us before, they had a really good reason to now. Basically, in the before time, settlers came on the scene with their livestock, mostly cattle. As the practice of agriculture grew, animals on the wolves' grocery list like buffalo started disappearing from the aisles. All it took were a few going after livestock for America to declare a war on wolves. Any wolf that was spotted within the same area code as livestock was immediately taken off the census with brutal prejudice. At one point, even the US Army showed up and got their shots up. And to add insult to massacre, in 1883 there was a law passed that prohibited hunting of most animals in the park. And wouldn't you know, wolves were not most animals. They even tried to justify it by calling wolves an undesired predator and implied that the environment would be better off without them. Basically, America gaslit wolves. It's like if you broke into my house, replaced most of the food in my refrigerator, and then turned me and my family into chalk outlines for touching the ground beef you left in my freezer. Now, guys and gals, on a scale from Reddit incel to Tiana Trump, how screwed do you think we were after we basically squad wiped wolves? The answer? We got casting couched. Without wolves applying top-down pressure, the elk population got out of pocket and they ate the area code. Cause even with cougars, coyotes, and even bears, the main thing keeping the elk down got put on the newspaper by us, and as a result it stripped the land of vegetation. But it actually went deeper than that. Without the threat of wolves keeping the elk on the move, the elk were able to stay in one place and eat that place completely clean. Animals that relied on wolf leftovers like ravens, magpies, and even bears had to get their protein elsewhere. And if that wasn't bad enough, one of the things that the elk destroyed was the willow. The same willow that dam building beavers needed to survive the winter. The same beavers responsible for creating wetlands, which meant yet another Jenga block that hit the hardwood. And I like to imagine the wolves that got murked on sight watched this all go down from the afterlife like, yeah, ain't that a bit? It got to the point where we had to airdrop wolves back to Yellowstone to try to Uno reverse the damage. And by the time we did that, there was only one colony of beavers left. Today there's about 100 wolves left in Yellowstone after we did everything in our power to abolish them. Because removing a keystone species is like leaving a toxic relationship. But then your life gets worse and worse until you realize, you were the problem. It's honestly the butterfly.
So that should give us some level of kind of idea of the just ecological impact, forget the human impact of the kinds of policies that happened during Western expansion. And the point being that, there are consequences to be paid for what are political and economic decisions to give land to folks, clear the land, have them bring cattle, and then kind of massacre wolves, for example, or people that live there because there needs to be more land for the cattle and for people, for specific people, to be able to have ranches with those cattle and so on. So we see the cost paid by different animals in hunting, from the otter to the beaver to the bison to the wolf and to indigenous folks and whatnot. I'm going to go ahead and bring the PowerPoint back at this time. Go into the slideshow, and then we are going to look in detail once again at the ongoing, at the time and ongoing, questionable to borderline horrific treatment of Native American folks on reservations. This is once again a content warning for those of you who might find this a little bit difficult. So, reservations. Reservations are pockets of land that the United States government leases to Native American tribes for them to live on, where they're able to have some degrees of autonomy, including some levels of passing their own laws, and freedoms to practice some of their, classic behaviors and beliefs. Not behaviors, that's the wrong term. Beliefs, practices, and whatnot. On paper, it's in some degree meant to be this idea of, hey, they get to go live on their own land and still be their own people and whatnot and kind of be separate. In reality, it is one of the bleakest, most depraved spaces ever created for people to live in ever. Um, the biggest, most important, not most important, but one of the biggest and most shocking stats, maybe I should say, on this is that the sexual assault rate, the word, it starts with a R and it ends with an E, of women on Native American reservations is 33%. 1 in 3 women report having been assaulted at least once in their lifetime. If that was a country, it would be the highest rate in the world by a large margin. The next highest country is, about 10%. Now, obviously, there's some reporting issues, so maybe that's more like 15 to 20% if you're being, extremely um, permissive with the definition, but still not close. Still not close. And the vast, vast majority of these assaults are committed by off-res, generally white men. And then here's the even worse rub. The nature of the contract with the government says that tribal authorities cannot cannot prosecute citizens that are not of their tribe for any crime committed on tribal land. It has to be done through police departments from the off-tribal land, and the police departments from off-tribal land almost never actually investigate or do any kind of due diligence on the crimes committed to women on tribal land. And so multiple times the tribal authorities will say, hey, this person did this thing, please go get them. And they're like, yeah, yeah, sure, we will. And then nothing happens. The staggering nature of these statistics is clearly appalling, first off, but second off, indicative of the fact that folks living on reservations are not treated as equal citizens, even though they are and should be. They're not treated as worthy of the dignity that any basic person deserves, because no one deserves this. No one deserves to live in fear of this. And it gets worse. We have a map over here, and that'll speak to kind of the second bullet point and this fourth bullet point, which is the life expectancy of the US, where dark blue is like the best, and all the way down to orange and red is the worst, and green and such is in the middle. And notice everywhere that is red or orange, in other words, significantly lower than the average, happens to be a Native American reservation. That is systemic logic depicted in an image at its finest. There is no way that if there was not a systematic difference between how people on these areas were treated and the people around them are treated, not 5 feet away, that the life expectancies would be so drastically different. To show some of the actual numbers, Native American men born in the United States on average are expected to live 68 years. And in as far as the kind of total population of the US, 76 years, 8 years of difference. And that's not the case just in the US. I can show you there's the same kind of statistics here for Canada, and I can pull the same up for other settler colonies like South Africa and Australia and New Zealand and so on, and it would look very much the same. The disparities are just as the image rightfully says, chasm. Even if it's not, okay, you're going to live less time or you're going to be, assaulted or whatnot, well, some other things that you can't do. Because the land is leased, it's what's considered trust land, not owned by the residents. Let me also do this so that you can. Nope, come back. Yes, that would be why. Um, sorry, trying to get the picture back, but it won't quite work. Um, because it's considered trust land, in other words, owned by the government and leased to the tribe, people who live on the land don't have ownership of it and therefore cannot use it as capital. They cannot sell the land, they cannot develop the land, they cannot make a business on the land, they can't accrue wealth from the increase in the value of the land. Those things go to the federal government. The federal government may allow them to, say, build a casino on the land, but if the casino increases the value of the land, they don't get those benefits. They have to pay a certain share to the federal government for the leasing rights to that land, and so on and so forth. And so even the little smidgen of the land that, was all originally theirs, that we are so in our benevolence willing to give to them, we still don't actually give to them. They don't have any kind of sovereign ownership of that land to this day. And that alone is, one of the biggest reasons that poverty is so high. Is, even if you do work to build your community, to build businesses, whatever it might be, to successfully kind of assimilate, well, you don't have your own land. You just don't. And one of the biggest ways that you can build wealth in, any kind of system, especially settler colonial system, is owning land. And that is why poverty rates for indigenous folks living on reservations is between 2 and 3 times higher than everyone else in the United States. Um, Beyond that, there's other health concerns beyond just the kind of basic life expectancy that we should consider, including, well, if your poverty rate is high, then usually you can't afford good food. We all know that going to Whole Foods or Gelson's or whatever to buy all the fresh organic stuff is way out of the budget of a adjunct professor, community college student, or anything like that. Wealth leads to improvements in health. It means that you have money to go buy a Peloton, to go home and work out, or, whatever it might be while you're doing your Zoom work from home. Whereas, other people have to go to jobs on site and, don't have, or work multiple jobs, for example, and therefore don't have time to do things like exercise or eat well or make salads or whatever it might be. So there's a very direct link between poverty and conditions like diabetes, heart disease, obesity, and whatnot that do have adverse health effects, but are usually caused by the inability to procure food beyond, the cheap stuff. And should the cheap stuff be cheaper? Not necessarily. We talked about in political economy previously that a lot of it comes from government subsidies of things like oil that make fried food cheaper than the actual vegetables that go in it in many cases. Potato chips versus potatoes, for example. Then you have the mental health aspect. So PTSD, depression, anxiety, all these things, important, valid, good to know. They are things that are stigmatized but becoming conversations, and that is a good thing. On average, it's estimated, for example, that the PTSD rate of folks in the US is between 4 and 6%. On Native American reservations, that number soars to between 20 and 25% of folks living on reservations exhibit symptoms of PTSD. So between 5 to 6 times the rate. That is absolutely devastating. And similar numbers I could show you for depression, for anxiety, for rates of self-harm, and all kinds of other mental health conditions that mostly stem from the just bleakness. There's no justice. People come in and do horrific things, they are not punished. There is poverty. You cannot actually build with hope anything of value without paying a huge tax to the federal government, and you don't have, sovereignty over your own land. Your health conditions are running rampant. Many of your elders in your family are probably have, they're not A, not living as long, very clearly, and B, have major health conditions. Why would it not be surprising that then depression and anxiety and whatnot are skyrocketing? But if the reservations are so bad, why don't folks just leave and go to the cities? People ask. No one's saying you have to live on the reservation, right? Kind of not. It is actually really difficult because your paperwork is different when you're raised on the reservation. Your citizenship status is slightly modified to actually be able to then travel out and get a job and housing and whatnot, and a driver's license and all those things in the state that you live in. It actually is a big paperwork nightmare. So logistically, it is in fact very much a challenge. You're not quite locked into the res, but it's almost like immigrating to a new country from the paperwork perspective to actually leave the res and live in the kind of quote unquote normal United States. And that stuff's expensive as well. So if you're in poverty, how are you going to afford all the paperwork that you have to do to be able to get out? Then also the reses are often in the middle of kind of nowhere. We see here again, like this is the North United States, so you have your Montana and your Wyoming and so on. It's not like there's big cities you can go to where there's a whole bunch of jobs and whatnot. And the cities that are there, well, there's also always that question of prevalent racism. Um, so all in all, even the distance to go to somewhere where you could find a job and better opportunities and whatnot, is itself then an issue. And then if you're going to file all the paperwork, can you do it just for you? Do you have to do it for your whole family? Do you have to do it for your elders? Where are you going to find the funds to move everyone and so on and so forth? So then there's that question of maybe you stay just because your family is there, everyone you know is there, everything you have known is there, and so on. And then finally, there's just that question of even if you do move, there's no guarantee that you're going to have, that you moved all that way and you're going to get the job, that you're going to get the opportunities, that you're going to actually be able to kind of navigate. Most of the time, you don't necessarily have access to college degrees or universities or whatnot, or even necessarily high school education and so on, because the schools are routinely underfunded, routinely like are unable to actually get all 12 grades staffed, and so on and so forth. So it just becomes extremely difficult to even get those base qualifications that we consider for jobs. So where do you go then? And the whole thing just kind of continues to cascade and cascade and prove that the project of indigenous destruction is not close to done. And even if we think of the idea of like violence against Native Americans is a thing from 100 years ago. No, it's not. It's a thing from yesterday and last week and the week before. And whether that's the systemic disparities or the rampant actual violence going on by folks from outside, I want to emphasize from that first stat that it's by off-site people. In other words, it's not that people within the reservation are harming other people from within the reservation. Other people come from outside and come in and do harm because they're like, we can get away with it. No one's going to try us. We're not going to go to jail and so on and so forth. We talked the last time about how jail is messed up. Trust me. But at the same time, this type of deplorable act should not be allowed to happen. Whether punishment is the best way to navigate that, separate question. But I think we can all agree that this is unacceptable. So, okay, that's the Homestead Act. We tried to massacre all the animals and all the people and so on and so forth, but that has to be the end, right? There isn't more. Let's go to the next bit. So then we have the GI Bill. GI, like the famous toy GI Joe, is a term used for U.S. soldiers, especially during the World War II era. And what the GI Bill was that veterans who fought during World War II for the U.S. could come back and get subsidized mortgages for their housing, basically interest-free loans to buy a house, as well as free education to universities, pensions and other payouts, and so on and so forth. So a whole bunch of benefits. These were signed by Democratic presidents. So this is not a right or left thing. It's just kind of a policy. Everyone kind of agreed that the veterans should be cared for. Okay, fine. Except the policy was explicitly written to favor white veterans and ignore black veterans. The famous U.S. historian Ira Katznelson documents this pretty thoroughly, and finds even the explicit Congress people and lawmakers that put the law together, usually Democrats, said that, this was a plan to perpetuate the Jim Crow South in the North, and that this was made to, grace white folks very specifically. There are like quotes and whatnot from all these people. And even if it's not just in the intention, it's also in the action, in the kind of implementation of the GI Bill. So the famous statistic that is used, which is a true statistic, is that in New York City, so again, not right or left question, New York City even then was one of the more politically progressive parts of the country, whatever that means. 67,000 subsidized mortgages were given to veterans within, the New York City area, all the boroughs and whatnot. Less than 100 were ever in the history of the GI Bill given to non-white veterans. Not just black folks, also all the Puerto Rican, Latin American, and Asian folks that fought in the military during World War II as well. Less than 100 people were able to benefit from the same benefits as 66,900 white folks. Beyond that, and that was not just the case in New York, this was the case across the country, but that stat alone should demonstrate the massive disparity, which was emblematic across the whole country. On a similar note, the other statistic that people often give, across the history of the GI Bill, 100,000 Black veterans applied for university scholarships to be subsidized by the government, and only 20% of those were ever paid out. And even then, there were a lot of restrictions put in place that the folks could only go to historically HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. They could not go to public universities with those funds. They could not go to Harvard and Yale with those funds. Even if they got in, they were made to kind of only go to Black colleges to kind of continue segregation in education, even after. Technically, the GI Bill was before Brown versus Board, but many of the payouts were done after Brown versus Board when integration in education was supposed to be happening in the 1950s. And so the segregation in education kind of continued. The thing about the GI Bill is those houses. Well, this was first off, maybe 70 years ago. This was not that long ago. Many people who got houses from the GI Bill are our grandparents. They're alive today. And they still probably have that house, that education. We all know how expensive education is. There's a reason many of us are here at CC is because it's at least marginally more affordable than Cal State's or UC's, and those are then, another class compared to your private universities. Those scholarships mean a lot of money in student loans that was not paid out. And then we have the concepts of redlining and real estate. We mentioned that land is kind of a major key portion of. Okay, sorry, Wells, for the choppy recording. We'll go ahead and continue. So I mentioned how real estate and land is one of the biggest and easiest ways to gain wealth and generational wealth, especially. We're going to talk a little bit about how that happens and ways in which that issues appear in that process. Redlining is the buzzword that surrounds this whole discussion. And redlining comes from the idea of people would draw red lines on maps that said the minorities live here and the white folks live here. And they would basically say that if you were a minority who wanted to live on the other side of the red line, then the banks would all get together and deny you a mortgage and say, no, you can't buy a house there. And even if the banks weren't doing it, it was very legal for a very, very long time to have what were called covenants, which were basically agreements amongst white folks in a neighborhood that they would never, under any circumstances, sell their house to someone who was not white. Both of these practices are illegal today, but they still kind of appear in many ways within policy. So banks still zone property and use what is called racial steering, where they kind of only approve loans if you're living in the correct side of town and deny loans if you're not, to maintain the barriers that redlining had created, even if the actual practice is technically illegal, because, banks still have jurisdiction over who does and does not get loans, and who and how those processes are approved or not is not subject to that much scrutiny. Um, but what redlining did and does, in its kind of alternate forms today, is it creates and maintains segregated communities. People live amongst people like them. The thing about this, though, is that the demographic makeup of a community significantly increases or influences property value, and that creates a significant inequality level. Um, that property value disparity is especially the case when we talk about predominantly white communities as opposed to predominantly Black or Latinx communities. Um, and that inequality is demonstrated very starkly in what those properties are worth to this day, not just during the era of redlining. That legacy continues. We'll see some of this in both the kind of Vox video for this week on Dodger Stadium, on the Starkman video on the kind of racial wealth gap. We'll see this on also the Netflix video on the racial wealth gap as well. And they'll kind of go into what these policies are, some of their ramifications, examples of them, and the ways that they play out all the way up to today. But some of the ways that I might demonstrate this for you. We have kind of ongoing effects in both the nature of people living in communities and the prices. And the nature of people living is partially because of the fact that the changes in wealth have a major impact on job prospects, on inheritance, and so on and so forth. So South Central Los Angeles compared to Malibu. South Central has 14 years less life expectancy on average than the average resident of Malibu, even though, Malibu up here, South Central over here, it ain't that far. 14 years less life expectancy. Santa Barbara versus Inglewood. An average resident of Inglewood has half the annual income than the average resident of Santa Barbara. Again, not too far from one another. The average LA home price increased by 275% since 1990. But in many neighborhoods, such as Irvine, or Beverly Hills or whatnot, that are predominantly white or model minority, that number is more between 10 and 20%. My grandparents, for example, had a house in Long Beach that they bought in the 80s for about $150,000. That same house today that they've lived in all the way up till now is worth almost 2 million. At the time, that area was not necessarily the nicest, but now it has been massively gentrified, and that demographic shift has meant that that property value has increased, and that wealth is wealth that they can use to then, go buy another house, using their house as collateral for a loan, that they can use to simply own their house and not have to pay rent every month and pocket the difference, as far as, that check that you would otherwise have to cut to the landlord, and so on and so forth. We'll look at a kind of exact image of all of this as it loads. Um, so single family homes, we have kind of a map here, but this is only for 1 year. Here's some of the neighborhoods in LA and the average or median price of those neighborhoods for one house. Marina Del Rey and such, you have your numbers well into the millions, Pacific Palisades in the 2 millions, and so on. And then you have LaSalle Park, 400,000. You have downtown LA, 200,000. Metropolitan Southwest, 200,000. Inglewood, 279,000. I think most of us know a lot of these communities. Beverly Hills, almost 2 million. Westwood, 1.5 million. Santa Monica, 1.5 million. Like we know these communities. We know who lives there. We know who doesn't live there. And the difference in value of homes for what is, Inglewood right here, and, what's it called? Downtown LA right here, whereas like Silver Lake is over here. Gentrified community, by the way. Whereas Pacific Palisades right here, like Santa Monica right here, these are not very far. for the property value to be that different is staggering. And that difference is because in the 30s, 40s, 50s, Los Angeles was cut up into red lines, and the areas that were on one side of the line were seen as good areas and surged to good property values, and the areas on the other side were seen as quote unquote bad areas and maintain a kind of lower property value. And that legacy creates so much of the economic disparity that we see today in those areas because having a house that's gaining value is such an important part of wealth building. More than anything, more than income, more than like stock market, more than anything like that, property. You'll see also in the video on Dodger Stadium the ways in which big infrastructure projects have a cost to those that maybe even do own houses, because inevitably, when those big projects come about, it is not Pacific Palisades and Beverly Hills that they decide to build the big stadium in. It's where Black and Brown and Asian folks live. So when I mentioned in week one how potentially one of the things that other countries can do is have Shinkansen like Japan and big trains. Well, unfortunately, if we did want the Shinkansen trains, the building of those trains would probably lead to the massive amounts of displacements of Black and brown folks. For the 405 alone, so there's a project called Freeway Widening in LA where they're like adding lanes to the 405 and other big highways. 150,000 people have been displaced to enable that project, which actually hasn't reduced traffic, by the way, since 2000 alone. So in the last, 20 some years. Forget, how many people had to be displaced to build the thing in the first place. Doesn't mean freeways are bad. We need them. And in fact, freeways are then built on land that is on kind of quote unquote bad communities, in other words, minority communities, to then increase the value to the adjacent quote unquote nice communities because they're next to all the freeways, which makes this really interesting cascade effect, where you can both get rid of the quote unquote seedy community so that your property value will increase and build a freeway which will further increase the property value of that same area, two birds with one stone. So that displacement then allows for then people to go into that community, expand the quote unquote nice community, and then the whole area that the freeway was built through becomes gentrified. Um, Inevitably, the freeway being built will lower the property values for a little bit until the freeway is done. And then once the freeway is done, the property values will soar, and the people who were kicked out to build the freeway cannot come back. And the thing about when you displace people for these big infrastructure projects is they are never, ever compensated correctly. Watch the Dodger Stadium videos for some more details if you would like. So on balance, all these policies together made it so that it was just really easy for a long period of time up to today to amass wealth for certain groups of people that it wasn't for others. I mentioned even, for example, just the fact that you own a home and you're not cutting a check to rent is a significant amount of money that you're pocketing. And some folks that, know people that own homes might then say, well, what about property taxes? We still pay property taxes if we own the home. So about that, there was a local policy called Proposition 13 that came about in the 80s in California. It's a California alone. So it's not a red or blue thing, it's a very California thing. California is one of the bluest states, and they still do this weird stuff. And what Prop 13 said is that if you owned your house in 1975, in other words, kind of pre-proper integration of folks post-civil rights and whatnot, and you still lived in that house, your property tax rate would be fixed to the value of your house in 1975. Here's the thing. Most of those $2 million houses these days were worth, $100,000 in 1975, give or take. Again, I know an exact example of that with my grandparents. And property tax is put at between 1 and 2%, depending on the county you live in, of the property that you live in. For a long time, it used to be the value of the property as it was the year you pay the taxes. And Prop 13 said, no, it's the value of the property in 1975 or when you purchase it. So if you buy the house off of someone who was cashing in, cheap property tax from 1975, and now you buy that house for 2 million, now you're cutting a check on property tax for 2% of 2 million, not 2% of the 100,000 from back in the day. And so it made it so that if you were benefiting from the GI Bill, from the Homestead Act in California, from redlining, from any of these policies that made it systematically easier for certain folks to get houses, you're still cutting a significantly smaller check to the government every year in property tax. And you're not paying rent. And you're able to, use that house for loans and capital and collateral and so on. And you're able to pass that wealth on to your children. And that is where the significant level of generational wealth disparity comes from. Even though today there is a small income disparity between different groups. And it's by small, I mean 20, $30,000 a year, like not nothing, but much less than before, between the different racial and ethnic groups in the United States. The wealth disparity is significant. And it is this property-based policy that is ongoing in its ramifications. Prop 13 is still on the books to this day. That really does create that massive disparity in wealth, even if the disparity in income is shrinking. What we have here on this graph is the average amount of tax subsidy for people based on Prop 13 by neighborhood demographics. In other words, the amount of money that Prop 13 is saving people every year in amount of tax they should pay if Prop 13 was like repealed based on demographic. For white folks, $9,500 a year. For black folks, $4,500 a year. For Asian folks, $5,500 a year. For Latino folks, $3,000 a year. So between 2 and 3 times the amount of money in tax simply because of Prop 13. And then cascading that is the fact that property taxes fund schools. So if your property value is higher and people are coming in and buying those houses that now are valued at crazy high, and because of the way Prop 13 works, once they buy the house from you in 2000, 2001, 2005, whatever, and they buy your house for $2 million or so on and so forth, and then they're paying property tax on that, those property taxes fund your schools. The number one source of funding for school districts is property taxes, and then the federal government from Department of Education, but property taxes. And that is one of the biggest reasons that schools in quote unquote nice neighborhoods are routinely better funded. The houses are worth more, and therefore the property tax is worth more, irregardless of Prop 13, because even if they're frozen at 1975, in 1975, those houses were still worth more than the 1975 value of the houses in the quote unquote seeded community. And so therefore the schools are getting cut massive checks that they can use to fund all their college prep programs and AP classes and salaries for good teachers and so on and so forth. And then you have a school disparity. And then from a school disparity, you have a college admissions disparity. And then you have all the things that cascade from that front on employment and job prospects and whatnot, beyond just the sheer economic benefits of the property themselves. Political economy, a local law that has such outsized effects on anything and everything, from the practice of redlining, legal practice encouraged by the city government of Los Angeles and plenty of other cities around the country. Prop 13, California state legislative practice put into law by a democratic process, and so on, as a prop, just like all the other props that we vote on every year. So it was, voted on by a majority of citizens and so on. At that time, the majority of citizens were white folks who were going to benefit from Prop 13, to be fair. So it totally makes sense. And all the other things that come from that, whether that's mental health, health concerns, the things that we talked about in the Indigenous folk slide, kind of once again manifesting because of the sheer difference in wealth. So that kind of closes the discussion on land and generational wealth and the wealth gap. I still recommend that you look at the materials and videos that are assigned for this week. They're very fascinating. Their videos and such are meant to be, easy watches as far as like consumption of the material, even if they're not easy watches from a kind of emotional, intellectual standpoint of like you're going to have to think about questions that you didn't have to think before. Every Dodgers fan out there be ready, for example. But it's not like Lakers and Clippers fans are exempt. The Inglewood Forum and the Staples Center are similar stories. Um, so, these are all going to be things that we will have to kind of grapple with, but they aren't, academic jargon. They're made for kind of a popular audience. So that should hopefully be good. And the idea, because these lectures are going to be thicker, denser, is that you have videos instead of readings, or you have short readings to kind of balance out that fact. The final thing we're going to talk about, though, before we close out the class entirely, is changing demographics. Um, so the United States, yeah, demographics are changing rapidly. Soon enough, we will be a majority-minority country. In other words, that the plurality of folks in the country will still be white. Plurality means the biggest single group, whereas majority is over 50%. And so the majority will soon not be white. California is already there. In fact, we are a majority and plurality minority state because Latino folks are actually the largest ethnic group, as you can see in this graph, as of even like 2010, and that disparity has only grown. Um, and so that has a major impact on the ways that, everything from government policy to people's popular attitudes shifts over time. To that end, beyond that, mixed and biracial folks are, being born in greater numbers. Marriages across racial groups are at an all-time high. It's not that they haven't always existed, whether they're marriages or kind of more questionable style relationships like Mr. Tommy Jeff had. Mixed and biracial folks are not like a new thing. I myself am one of them, for example. Um, and there's a common, the demo, or sorry, there is the interesting trend, is what I mean to say, that social class has become the major barrier to marriage and children and relationships, whereas race and ethnicity used to be the case before. So more and more people are willing to marry cross-race, cross-ethnicity, as long as both partners are kind of in the same social economic zone. And that is also a fascinating tendency, that we are still kind of prejudiced towards folks that make less money than us. But within the same space, we're significantly less prejudiced towards our, marriage partners. Um, and so that is also a big change. Um, in general, these trends show us that, we should be on a path towards greater diversity, greater tolerance, integration, rectifying a lot of these wrongs, correct? And on the one hand, yes, we have trends for sriracha sauce, which is a Thai and Malaysian hot sauce. We have references to, all kinds of foods from Taco Tuesday to, like chicken tikka masala in the UK being like the national dish, to all kinds of things that are integrate examples of that integrationist tendency. If you're living in Los Angeles, you can go to a Persian New Year gathering. You can go celebrate Holi with the Indian community. You can go to church with the Latin American folks at the Catholic Church, or you can go to a Dia de los Muertos celebration. You can do all of these little kind of cultural, like iconic celebrations, a dragon dance for Chinese New Year, whatever it might be. And that, on the one hand, is kind of evidence towards that increased path towards toleration. But on the other hand, no, in the sense of the social class prejudice still does maintain a lot of those disparities. We still see these major kind of shifts on the lines of social class and the legacies of race, such as the housing stuff we just talked about a few minutes ago. Hi, Doug. Um, and beyond that, the fact that to kind of rise in social class requires the model minority assimilationist tendency. In other words, that to do well, you kind of have to paint yourself with the same with the brush that the non-minority world wants you to act like, and that if you maintain too much of your identity, you will very often not necessarily do quite as well. Um, to that end, we will talk about the concept of hypodescent, which is one of the articles that you'll read for this week, which is, near and dear to my heart as someone who is a biracial and multi-ethnic person. So when a person, the idea of hypodescent is that when a person is mixed race or ethnic and they phenotypically display traits that show that they aren't just one thing, in other words, they don't pass super well, they will be treated as they race or ethnicity with the quote unquote lower social and economic position. The authors argue that this stems from the one drop rule, which was a rule during the Jim Crow era and whatnot, that if you had even quote unquote one drop of Black ancestry, you would be subject to the segregationist policies against Black folks, even if you were a majority white. And that was, on the legal books for a long, long, long time. Um, and hypodescent is kind of seen as the natural evolution of that into a more um, politically correct world that still does operate with race as a major organizing force. Examples of folks who maybe are emblematic of this hypodescent philosophy include, former President Barack Obama, who's half black, half white, and most people don't even know that he's part half white. The hypo descent means that he's kind of mostly treated as just a black president. Steph Curry, similarly, half black, half white. Most folks treat him as a black athlete as opposed to lionizing him as a white athlete in the way that, say, Larry Bird was in the 80s. Current presidential candidate Kamala Harris, half Indian, half black, mostly treated as, the first black woman to run for president and potentially become president. Again, being recorded before the election, I don't know what's going to happen. Um, Instead of, and some people still like, the Indian community sometimes tries to own her, but sometimes doesn't actually, because of the fact that they themselves are quite anti-black and quite racist in many ways, and therefore kind of don't see her as actually belonging into that community, and so on. Dwayne Johnson is black and Samoan. Most people don't even know that he's Samoan. He's kind of just treated as a, black wrestler and later actor. Naomi Osaka actually carries a Japanese passport, but is half black and Japanese, and most people treat her as a black woman, even though she's technically like not even American. Not that black people are only American, obviously, but she's like a Japanese citizen and yet doesn't get treated as Japanese by most people. Two other examples as far as the images are Zendaya and then WNBA All-Star Nafisa Collier as other examples of prominent biracial folks who really kind of exhibit that hypodescent tendency of getting treated as the non-white or, in the case of like Osaka or Johnson, the quote unquote more prejudiced against background. And the reason I find hypodescent so fascinating is it says a lot about our ability to accept a changing world where mixed folks are most common. Why can't we just say the first biracial? Why can't we just say, a mixed person or so on? It has to, the lines of race, despite the fact that they're being more and more blurred by the day, seem to still remain one person, one category in most of our imaginations. And that's a really kind of interesting cognitive thing for us to interrogate. And beyond that, for the folks that actually are mixed, I did a significant amount of research late in my undergrad and early in grad school on what I call conditional belonging, which is that idea that in biracial or ethnic homes, the extended family does often treat the biracial individual as belonging to their group only if the person renounces their claims to the other group. So, for example, to use Kamala Harris as the example, many Indian folks, not necessarily in her family, but also just like in the public, would treat her as Indian only if she like showed Indianness to such a degree as to renounce her blackness. And at the end of the day, you really can't do that. You are both. And there's not really a way to escape that because then on the other side's going to be like, hey, yo, what about me? And that continues to show that we see race as a uncrossable line, as this kind of you're with me or against me, which first off, race is a created, when we say it's a social construct, we mean that humans invented it. It is not based on any scientific reality. It is not based on any kind of natural difference amongst people, but it has real consequences because it's a human invention, much the same way that something like law is a human invention that has major, major consequences. It's also a social construct. Um, Money is another example of a social construct that has massive implications and that we believe is true. Why we decided that paper is going to be the thing that we use for money? Well, because it's easy and cheap to produce. But people have used all kinds of things as substitutes for money. It's just today that we decide that it's metal coins and paper. But we could have easily just valued cowrie shells like indigenous folks, or we could have valued, a different type of metal, say like tin, as opposed to gold as the most valuable, and so on. So these are all social constructs in that they are invented by human beings and given their power and belief by the human imagination. But that doesn't mean that they don't have significant impacts on our daily lives. So social construct doesn't mean that it's like irrelevant. It just means that it's not based on any kind of tangible material fact other than the simple fact of its existence and belief by the vast majority of people in society. So to close out this class, first off, I just want to really give everyone a pat on the back for navigating what has been a lot of material. I think everyone's done a really good job. I'm really proud of you all, and I really am um, astounded to see your growth and to see how you have continued to develop. I do hope that you found this class interesting, that you found it meaningful, and that it taught you a little something about the way that, politics works. I want to emphasize just a few points as big takeaways for you all is to meditate on, to think on, as you go to wherever you end up taking your life. And I wish you the best of luck in that direction. Those questions are, what is political and why? A big thing that this class has emphasized is that a lot of things are, in fact, political. Politics is a structure of power that reaches into pretty much everything that we see, breathe, hear, eat, touch. And I will read a quick passage on this note for us to go ahead and think about this further. So we're going to go here. And we're going to read from the author Jennifer Mullen. It's a book called Decolonizing Therapy. And I'm going to read from this point. It's also political. So there cannot be mental and emotional healing without a politicized framework. Everything is political. The land, capital L, that we live on, the rivers in the Amazon, whether your 3 p.m. client has health insurance, whether health insurance is universal for everyone or in the country in which you reside, how the t-shirt you have just purchased was sourced and by whom or what and where, how your grandfather, great-grandfather, or great-great-uncle came to the place you grew up in, whether it is safe to be queer and out to your family, whether your emotional well-being was considered while growing up, whether your body feels safe enough to take on a lover or two or three, whether you can speak out against microaggressions and covert or overt racism in your place of work and residence or in your relationships, whether you'll be followed into your corner store, whether or everything is political inherently, whether our mother received prenatal care throughout their pregnancy, whether you grew up knowing your birth mother, whether you were required to live separately from your birth mother because of mandates of laws from the state, whether you grew up in various homes or one home in foster care, whether you're seen as attractive or smart or likable is political. Your skin tone and shape of your body have been made political. Whether you have access to affordable healthcare or holistic medicine in addition to the medical industrial complex is very political. Whether your family has a summer or upstate or lake house is political. Whether you have 9,000 or 900,000 in your bank account is so political. Whether you pass as the gender you are, political. Whether small tasks, habits, and purchases feel political or not is in fact political. And whether this passage and book doesn't appeal to you, and you can afford to put it on your bookshelf and never look back at it again, is political. So that passage kind of speaks to a lot of the emphasis on this class that everything is in fact political. I've tried to display some of the ways in which those things that the passage talks about and others kind of find their way into our life and the reasons why they are in fact political and related to politics and policy and so on. Because at the end of the day, politics is less about the exact person in the office today in a democratic country, for example, and more about the policies and structures that dictate our relationship to the state and the world around us. Policy outlives those in office by a long, long shot. When redlining was first legalized and implemented by FDR in the 30s, he did not probably think, or maybe he did, who knows, that we would still be feeling the consequences of that today in 2024. When the Homestead Act was written in, 1862 by Abraham Lincoln, he probably didn't think that the entire Western United States' animal population would feel the impact of that policy long after a bullet was put in his head by John Wilkes Booth. Policy and structures remain. And that is the essence of what politics is. Notice I've talked very, 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 very little about specific leaders in the course of this class, because most of what I try to focus on is on the ways that these systems work. Everything from, when we talked about federalism and the Constitution and whatnot, to today when we talk about all these different policies around real estate and around dissent and whatnot. These are politics. And then finally, I want you all to kind of glean and meditate on, okay, so we have policy, we have a structure of power, and we live allegedly in a democracy where we can have some impact on those structures of power. But even then, I want us to kind of consider when we talk democracy, who is represented in the democracy? By what systems? The literal title of the book, How Democratic is the American Constitution? Where can those ideas of the kind of collective decision making be improved upon? Where can those ideas of the representation of all equally be modified? Where are areas of success that other places could look on and learn from us? Who and where is power given to and why? Some of the policies we talked about today show very clearly that the democracy in the United States has had a very, 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 and does have a very, very, very heavily racialized undercurrent to it, where certain folks are empowered and certain folks are not. By these same systems that are supposed to represent us all. Does that mean that they can never represent us all? Certainly not. There is very much the capacity to do so. But that does require a significant amount of growth and thought and development by us. And the first step to that is to go through a class like this, where hopefully we get the number one thing that I would want you all to take away from the time that we share together is the ability to have discernment, to be able to go through material like this and come to your own conclusions, to be able to see things for what they are, to be able to look through the many interwoven pieces and see where they all begin to connect and lace together. Nothing exists in isolation, and social science 101 is it's always, always, always complicated. Hopefully the class has begun to make a little bit of sense of that complication and given you the tools and the language to be able to kind of meditate on some of these questions and given you, I hope, questions just as much as answers that you will take, with you forward. With that, I want to wish you best of luck on the final exam. Mention that it's been a pleasure to have you all in class, and that I do hope that wherever your endeavors take you in the future will be a, wonderful time. Thank you so much. Take care, alls, and see you on the other side.